Hello, my name is Daniel, a Senior Cloud Solutions Architect at Microsoft. Welcome to the second video in this series. I gave a brief overview of our FHIRPower app in the last video. Today, I would like to continue where we left off and go a little deeper into understanding how we leverage the Component Framework and Custom Connector to create the app. We won't be going over any basics today since there are a plethora of Power Apps 101 resources out there in the web. Let me tell you what Component Framework is before we begin. As the word suggests, it allows app makers to componentize UI elements. This way, you won't have to copy and paste same UI elements across different screens. If you want to go deeper, developers can take advantage of code components and enhance UI elements such as forms and views with HTML, CSS, and TypeScript. They can then package the HTML, CSS, and TypeScript files into a single package, which then can be exported from and imported into other Power Apps. For the purpose of this video, however, we will just use the component framework that is available right from Power Apps to componentize our UI elements. Well, before I begin, you must have a custom connector already created. If you don't know how to and want to actually learn more about how to create one, check out the link in the description below where my coworker goes into details on how to create a custom connector. Now, once you have the custom connector created, let's click on that cylinder database icon to add our connector. These are the list of connectors that you're able to use, and since I've already created and connected our FHIR custom connector, let me click it. Now that it's been added, let's go and see how you can access the actions within the connector. Let's go to the appointment screen, go to the invisible section. What this section will do is when the screen is visible, it will run the lines of code that are in the text block. As you can see, this is how we call on custom connectors. We simply type the name of the connector and call the function to retrieve or to store. Without going too much into details of what this code does, all this is doing is retrieving information from our FHIR server using the connector to create a collection of items that will be used in the screen. Well, for this next collection, we didn't create the function in the connector to retrieve the specialty code, so please excuse the hard-coded mess. But let's go to the top of this code and start typing our connector's name. FHIR, FHIRPower, dot, and then if you press the down arrows, you can see all the functions that are available for this connector. That means you have the intelligence working, meaning our app can reference the connector. Perfect. Now you have the connector working. Let's go over to the component and retrieve and play with the records. When we first developed this app, we were very much infant Power App developers. We didn't really think about reusability or modularizing UI elements, but now that we've matured a little, we've realized components will allow UI controls such as our slot component we'll be covering to be reusable across multiple screens and multiple apps. So that is what we did. These are the UI elements we've used in the past for the slot section. All these UI elements are invisible right now because the slot component is on top and I hidden the other elements. And this is the component. As you can see, it's just one UI element within the screen. If you go to the component layer, you can see that we still have the same layers we've used on the screen side, but they're all tied together as a component, which we can now use it across multiple screens and apps. Now let's get into the meat of it. Let's go to our onReset section in the component. This section will run whenever the component is reset or reloaded onto this screen. We'll come back to the code later. Now, these are the custom properties we added, so values can be passed into and out from the component. These two are the input parameters, the values that are needed for the component to retrieve the time slots. And these are the output properties that are needed to pass onto the screen that hosts the component. We will use these output parameters to construct the object to create an appointment. These outputs are created by going to the properties and clicking New Custom Property. You choose which type of property you want: output, input, or behavior. We discussed what output and input is. In behavior, you wouldn't be able to see this unless you enable it. So how you enable behavior is by going to the settings, upcoming features, experimental, and turning on the enhanced component properties. We use this type to bubble up an event from the component up to the hosting screens. And finally, we have the data types. For example, all we will be using is the text data type. And you can see that we're raising an on reset anytime a value of these input parameters change. That way, when the patient changes the specialty, the slot components will be reset. Let's go back to the Screens tab. Click on the component, and let's put some values into our input parameters. First, let's look for slot start and set it with the date selected from the calendar and the slot specialty code with the selected specialty from the specialty dropdown. These variables that I'm mentioning are the UI elements for the specialty dropdown and the data element that you see here. Raise event property is our behavior property I mentioned before. In short, it bubbles up an event when a time slot is selected from the component. And we have this conditional statement which determines whether the schedule appointment button we see down here should be enabled or disabled depending on whether a time slot is selected or not. Now that we have the input parameters set, we can use them to retrieve the time slot information. Let's go back to our component and go to the onReset section. FHIRPower custom connector is being referenced the same way as it was previously used on the screen. This time though, we will use the input parameters we just set to retrieve and create a collection of time slots. Next set of code is to update the button and the time selected label to their default state. So the button to make the appointment will be disabled and the time selected label will be empty. We now retrieve the time slots, and I will go over how you can set the output parameters after selecting the time slot. If you look here on the right, these are all the output parameters we have defined. We'll go over just one of the output parameters as all of the output parameters are retrieved in a similar fashion. We need to access an element in our FHIR slot object. FHIR objects can be very flexible with their structure, and we could have excluded arrays to make these code look less quote-unquote hacky, but we wanted to keep the structure as close as possible to the standard. So in our case, we need to retrieve a value that is inside of an array that is inside of another array. We've structured our resource so we only have one item inside these arrays. So all we will be doing is accessing the first element of each array. The isSelected output is set to false when the component is loaded in the beginning. But when a time is selected, we raise an event to the hosting screen, and this value is also set to true. Let's go to the screen, go to the raise event parameter in the component. You can see once a time slot is selected, this code will enable the schedule button. Right, let's click on this button. Here we are calling the create appointment function from the custom connector. You can see the output parameters we set in the components are now being used. Once the button is enabled and clicked, this object will be sent to the FHIR server and it will have created an appointment object like we see here. I know there was a lot to take in, but I hope it was a simple yet informative session. This was a very simple example, but I hope I was able to show you the possibilities when all these technologies are combined. Now, it's time for you to go and create something cooler than our app. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, take care.